Well, thank you very much. There are a number of matters that I need to deal with before I get to the main part of my talk. First, of course, is that working in the National Museum, one of the joys of working in the National Museum is that you work every day with outstanding colleagues. And I'm here, obviously, making these statements on behalf of a team in the National Museums that are working on this project. They're Alice Blackwell, the Glenmorangie Research Officer, Martin Goldberg, the Early Historic Curator, and Fraser Hunter, the Principal Curator of Later Prehistory and Early History. Fraser, in turn, is coordinating a team of European scholars who are reassessing the Trepaine treasure. And some of you may have attended the one-day meeting last summer that the Society held on Roman silver. Although this work is taking place within the overall structure of the project, I'm not going to say very much about it this evening. In fact, I'm not going to say anything about it this evening except to mention it one more time, in passing. So on behalf of all these people, and indeed on behalf of the National Museums of Scotland, I want first of all to express my thanks to Glenmorangie for their generous, enlightened and wholehearted support of the project. All of their staff have been wonderful to work with, but I must particularly thank Hamish Torrey, who has provided constant encouragement throughout the 3 years of the project. Now, why you may wonder, are Glenmorangie supporting research into early historic Scotland? Well, it is, as I've said on several previous occasions, the first instance of the drinks industry supporting archaeology rather than the other way around. It began when Glenmorangie, having become part of Louis Vuitton by Hennessy, sought to rebrand their whisky. And as part of this, they created a new symbol, a new signet for their brand, based on part of the decoration on the stone of the Cadwell that occupies a key place in the Early People Gallery in the museum. The stone's original location, insofar as we know it, was very close to Glenmorangie House, and this evocation of place was an important element in their brand identification. The sponsored research aims to enrich our understanding of both time and place through innovative approaches that could simultaneously be used to strengthen Glenmorangie's brand identity. Finally, I need to say a few words about my title, A Jewel of Gold Placed in a Silver Dish. Of course, at one level, you can regard a jewel of gold placed in a silver dish as the jewel of gold is Glenmorangie's sponsorship and the silver dish is the museum, yeah? But we do a little more subtle than that, I hope. Anyway, the phrase is borrowed from a poem associated with Iona and invoking God's protection against calamities brought on by the elements such as lightning and thunderstorms. The translation is that of which we've used to borrow from is Thomas Clancy and Gilbert Marcus from their wonderful book on the earliest poetry on Iona. The phrase itself may well be an allusion, they suggest, to John the Baptist and the delivery of his head on a silver dish to King Herod. That's not our interest, I hasten to add. Our interest in the phrase is not, though, linked to the specific matters of its use in the poem. Instead, we chose it for a number of reasons. First of all, because we have an object, a version of this, in the St. Ninian's Isle treasure, a bowl with a silver bowl with a gold jewel in the middle. Secondly, it reflects the way that objects can convey symbolic messages that transcend the more straightforward functions. And this emphasis on objects is fundamental to our approach throughout the whole project. And third, the overall context of the phrase is Christian, and Christianity is the great new belief system that dominates our period. And finally, we believe that through the full appreciation of the surviving objects from Scotland, that they may come to be seen as one of the jewels of gold placed in the silver dish of early historic Europe. At the moment, this is, I have to say, no more than an aspiration. The principal reason for that is that our current frameworks are almost entirely constructed around texts, around the historical records. And Scotland, of course, has almost none of these at this period. Its history in this early period is constructed largely from the comments of outsiders. These limited snippets are full of uncertainty and ambiguity. The result is that when European-wide studies are undertaken, Scotland is usually just a blank. This is Chris Wickham's map from his book, Framing the Early Middle Ages. But you'll notice here, Scotland, region not discussed in this book. Okay? So in European terms, the British Isles means Ireland and Anglo-Saxon England. This is an understandable, if from a Scottish point of view, an unhelpful position. But it doesn't stop there. The focus on England has chronological implications. The early historic world in England begins after the departure of Rome at the beginning of the 5th century AD. Rome, though, is effectively gone from Scotland, as a presence on the ground at least, by the beginning of the 3rd century. The 2 centuries between have become lost centuries in Scotland's past. No doubt Rome, from its bases in northern England, retained an interest in events farther north and attempted from time to time to influence those events either diplomatically or militarily. Yet Septimius Severus's death at York in AD 211, the 1800th anniversary of which coincidentally falls on this Friday, and the subsequent abandonment of campaigning in Scotland marks the beginning of the early historic period in Scotland. The elements that will form the groups that play out the events of early historic Scotland until and beyond the arrival of the Vikings are all in place at that time. Pretty much. One might argue about the Scots. That's why we've started our studies at AD 300, not the more usual 500. It's why we're looking, as part of the project, at the Traprain treasure, my one mention of this thing. Of course, its individual objects can only be understood in terms of the Roman world, but its deposition has to be understood, at least in part, in terms of early historic Scotland. Unlike England, the prestige medal in Scotland is silver, not gold. Those of you that were here a couple of months ago, when Gareth Williams talked about the Staffordshire hoard, will have seen Anglo-Saxon gold coming out your ears. Okay? In Scotland, the prestige medal is silver. Much of that silver comes from the reworking of Roman silver objects like those found at Traprain. We even have a fragment of a Roman spoon, and those of you that are close enough may be able to see the letters of the inscription on it. You have to take my word that this is a spoon. It's a bit bashed around now, but anyway, it is the bowl of a Roman spoon. From the early historic hoard found at Norwich Law in Fife, another hoard that the project is re-evaluating, and about which I'm saying nothing this evening. Paradoxically, although Scotland's historical record is so weak that it causes the country to be a blank on European maps, it is still deemed strong enough to provide the appropriate frameworks for interpreting archaeological material. These frameworks have two interlinking aspects: the ethnic makeup of what we now call Scotland and the traditional history involving kings, battles and dates, for which we have very little archaeological evidence. Both of these provide unhelpful constraints to our thinking. Let's turn first to ethnicity. And as an illustration of the difficulties of applying ethnic labels to objects, here are Leslie Alcott's comments on the Hunterston brooch. He said, "It is not difficult to imagine a brooch of ultimately Irish form, embellished with both Celtic and Germanic motifs, being made in a Scotic workshop in a part of Dalriata which was politically under Pictish control at the time." It is, of course, a carefully chosen example by Leslie to support his argument that we should be using the term insular to describe objects made somewhere in northern Britain or Ireland. But it demonstrates how inappropriate it is to see objects in these ethnic terms, to talk about Pictish silver chains or Anglo-Saxon spearheads. But there is a further problem with these attempts to apply ethnic labels to material culture. These ethnic groups are almost entirely based on the perceptions of outsiders. As a result, the extent and boundaries of their respective territories are vague and imprecise. Large areas of Scotland are not easily or assuredly accommodated within these territories. I offer you one or two blank areas on this map. But these apparently blank areas are full of sites that appear to have early historic occupation, something that Robert Stevenson identified more than 50 years ago, but which has been largely ignored since. And the objects from these sites are similarly left in limbo because there is no easy ethnic label to be applied to them. Stevenson was concerned with pins, but the same consideration applies to bone combs. Yet both of these categories are among the most numerous types of object that we can date to the early historic period. Similar difficulties arise when we try to link material culture with the history of that period. The desire for the firm dates that this might provide has led many into what we think of as uncritical linking of objects and texts. A good example of this is provided by the battle scene or scenes on the back of the stone in Aberlenno churchyard in Angus. They have regularly been interpreted as images of the Battle of Dunechtan that may or may not have been fought nearby in AD 685. The equation between the battle and the monument is supported by the martial imagery of the stone. It is largely based on the geographic proximity of Aberlenno to Dunechan Hill, approximately 3.5 miles apart, where scholars have long thought the battle was fought. It has come to feature in academic studies, textbooks, and more popular works. One scholar has used this supposed portrayal of a historical event to date the stone to some 4 decades after the battle. This historically based judgment has also enabled ethnic labels to be applied to the figures. Picts are bare-headed, Anglo-Saxon Northumbrians wear helmets. The evidence adduced in support of this is twofold. First, Picts are not shown on any other stone wearing helmets. And second, from rare finds, we know that the Anglo-Saxons had helmets. A particularly fine example has been recovered from Coppergate, York, in Northumbrian territory. I think it may well be the only fine example recorded from Anglo-Saxon Northumbria. But nevertheless, it's been used and invoked in this way. Yet the absence of helmets may only reflect the absence of other battle images of Picts. We certainly have no idea whether helmets were worn by either Britons or Scots, for instance. And even without Alex Wolff's recent convincing demonstration that the Battle of Dunechtan took place much farther north, severely weakening the link between the battle and the Aberlenno stone, there was very little justification for these historically derived ethnic attributions. The sculptor has provided guides to help a reading of the stone. One side's arms are in relief, I don't know how many of you be able to see it. These are the things of the leaf. On one side, arms are inside. And this does not just seem to be an attempt at providing some perspective. The presence or absence of helmets could then be a similar device, and it might not be any more significant than that. Nevertheless, the reading of the scene is far from straightforward, and I'm not going to attempt one here. Modern commentators certainly can't agree about it. Much depends on whether the image is recording an actual battle, an imagined one, or providing a generic image of warfare. The levels of required realism might well be different in each case. Making a judgment, we will also need to take into account that this is our only portrayal of a battle scene, nor can its presence on a larger monument be wholly ignored. The key image on the other side of the stone is a Christian cross in high relief. It's the dominant motif of the whole monument. Of course, success in battle was regularly interpreted in early historic texts as signifying the victor's enjoyment of God's support. And so a memorial to a particularly significant battle success might not be inappropriately linked to an image on the cross. But equally, we may be dealing with a generic representation of an activity familiar to all in early historic Scotland, intended here to illuminate religious teachings. The latter may only require an illustration convincing in terms of the teachings, but not necessarily accurate in all its details. None of this, of course, explains the presence of the two symbols above the panel showing the battle scene. If then ethnic labelling and links with historical texts inhibit rather than enhance our understanding of early historic objects, how then might we proceed? Well, we have been exploring, I think with some success, an approach rooted in the objects themselves with three different strands. First, we've been obtaining radiocarbon dates for some objects. Second, we've been looking intensively, but with a critical eye, at the interpretation of well-known objects. And finally, we've been using craft commissions to explore and understand those objects for which our evidence was weak, but not non-existent. So let's look at each of these three strands in turn. Our first strand has been the radiocarbon dating of objects. Radiocarbon dating has been around for a long time now. It seems like anyway, 50 or 60 years almost. But usually the date for objects has been derived from animal bone or plant material found in the same layer as the particular object. In a program led by Alison Sheridan that began with objects intended for display in the Museum of Scotland, we have been pioneers in applying radiocarbon dating directly to the objects themselves. Initially, our interest was principally in prehistoric material, but with the advent of the Glenmorangie project, we have begun to look at early historic material. And I want to give you just three brief examples. First, we dated the ox phalange from the Brockaburian on North Ronaldsay in Orkney that is decorated with two symbols that appear on stones across eastern Scotland. The calibrated date is AD 570 to 655. There's nothing particularly surprising about this date, except that it is the first and only independent date for such symbols. Second, we dated an antler knife handle with an Ogham inscription found at the Broch of Gurgas in Orkney. Calibrated date is AD 340 to 540. This is interesting because it suggests that Ogham has reached Orkney before the supposed movement of the Scots into western Scotland or the arrival of Columba of Iona, either of which might have explained the arrival of Ogham in Scotland. Certainly just a little early for conventional definitions of when Ogham was around. And finally, we dated 10 long-handled bone cones from sites in the Hebrides and Orkney. The calibrated dates range from early in the 1st century BC until the middle of the 7th century AD. This gives us a new perspective on a type of object that seems to have died out in southern England with the arrival of the Romans. Here in Scotland, of course, it's reflecting that element of continuity that runs from the Iron Age into the early historic period. But it's also raising another issue. These cones are being used on the evidence of these dates for at least 700 years. Now, their function is not wholly agreed, but the general view would see them as having some part in the creation of textiles. What happens in the middle of the 7th century AD that renders this type obsolete is a serious question, because it's clear from other evidence that textile manufacture does not stop at the same time. If this pattern is mirrored in other objects, we will be faced with explaining social change, at least in the north and west, that finds very little echo in the historical texts. Indeed, if we can undertake an extensive program of dating, it may start to show patterns of change and development that are largely absent from the historical records. Turning now to the second strand that involves the evaluation of well-known pieces, I want to look as an example at shrines and reliquaries, and necessarily this involves a certain amount of tedious detail. I warn you now in advance. I want to begin with the Jedburgh shrine. Bradford's interpretation of the large slab decorated with inhabited vine scroll as part of a shrine has been endorsed by subsequent commentators. The form that Radford suggested for the shrine remains unique. This is Historic Scotland's version on this bit. This is Radford's rather more prosaic reconstruction. He modelled the suggested size for the shrine on St Cuthbert's wooden coffin with dung. The form of the roof, while in part an interpretation of the surviving fragments, was also clearly influenced by the portable house shrines like Monmouth, to which I will come in a moment. You can see a small image up there. Close examination of the stone does, however, raise serious questions about Radford's interpretation. In offering these comments, we recognise that there are uncertainties created by the subsequent history of the stone. Romilly Allen, for instance, recorded that it was, quote, formerly used as a lintel in the opening of the south side of the chancel of the abbey, and it is now kept, he says, in the north transept. Well, of course, it's moved on a bit since Romilly Allen's day, and it's now its own little museum in Jedburgh. We don't have any other information regarding its reuse, but the possibility that there are several reuses must be acknowledged, perhaps resulting each time in modifications to the stone. Now, two areas of the stone are key to Radford's interpretation. The first is the reconstructed groove on the back of the stone. As it exists at present, it's just this very long rebate. What Radford saw is this as a groove. Indeed, he considered it had once been a groove from which the outer edge had subsequently been removed. But our examination suggests that it was once a shallow rebate that's been extended. So we take the opposite view. We think this is the original line. It's been cut farther in. The second area for Radford was that he saw in this slight upturn there was sufficient to enable Radford to reconstruct it like this. He read a 65-degree angle on this, and he interpreted it as the remains of a groove holding the roof panel. I have to say our examination found no evidence for the groove, and further, the upstand has so little remaining that it could plausibly be seen as the remains of a vertical edge. Either of our interpretations here, if correct, make Radford's interpretation of the piece as a shrine panel unlikely. In none of the proposed reconstructions is it possible to have confidence in the stability of a shrine given the weights of the stones involved. Nor has anyone explained how the vine scroll decoration of the slab might be reconciled with the proposed roof shapes. The surviving vine scroll is of such high quality that it is difficult to believe that it was finished at the top with the kind of cramped decoration that either of the proposed roof structures would have required. And it's interesting that the reconstructions never show you how the decoration is going to work out. There's a further aspect of the slab that requires comment. The left-hand edge is much more damaged than the right one. But there is a suggestion that it is not the mirror image of the right-hand one that Radford supposed. What survived might better be interpreted as the centre of a panel that was twice as wide as the existing one. And we offer this interpretation with some diffidence, given that it's completely made up. But this large panel with a high central area could easily accommodate the other fragments of vine scroll ornament from Jedburgh. In summary, then, we believe that neither the groove on the back of the stone nor that for the sloping roof can be found on the surviving stone. We further think that the reconstruction, whatever the form of the roof, can't be reconciled with the decorative scheme. But of course, there was one further element in Radford's suggestion made him think it was a shrine in the first place. And this was what Cramp described, and I quote Rosemary Cramp's words, Radford's attractive supposition that the fragments were part of Boysel's tomb from Melrose. Radford opted for Boysel as the most likely enshrined figure in the locality, one of the few saints around. And another clear case, I would suggest, of fitting archaeological material inappropriately to the partial historical records. From this, it was a short step to locate the shrine originally at Old Melrose. Proof is lacking, said Radford, but the evidence clearly suggests that the sculptured fragments now in the museum at Jedburgh belong to a shrine standing in some other church, and that the shrine was, in all probability, that of St. Boysel at Old Melrose. Quite why the fragments then were transferred to Jedburgh rather than to Melrose, Radford didn't feel needed an explanation. Now, none of this evidence, we would suggest, makes anything like a convincing case for the fragments from Jedburgh being part of a shrine. In saying this, it needs to be remembered that in the time since Radford wrote, Northumbrian sculptured fragments have subsequently received detailed study from Rosemary Cramp without revealing any further fragments of a shrine like Jedburgh. The two pieces with vine scroll decoration are more plausibly seen, we think, as part of a chancel screen or similar fitting, presumably within an earlier church in Jedburgh. Let me turn now to St Andrew's sarcophagus. The examination of the sarcophagus raises a number of issues related to its construction and use as a shrine. Our description of these issues is very much more in terms of posing questions rather than providing answers. Essentially, we're concerned with three different but related elements: the length and size of the mortise grooves in the corner slabs, and the nature of the tenons on the surviving side and end panels, the overall dimensions of the surviving end and side panels, and the nature of the lid. Now, the surviving mortise grooves on the corner slabs are remarkably shallow, less than 30 millimetres in all but one case. These shallow grooves do not bear comparison with grooves like this, cut into the slab from my feet, some 55 millimetres deep. Moreover, they seem, in every case where the evidence survives, to extend to the top of the corner slab. This might be a necessary feature if the constructional sequence required the anchoring of the corner posts in position before the side and end slabs were inserted. But in no other shrine fragments that we know has this feature been observed. The consequence of this situation is that the mortise grooves are longer than they need to be to accommodate the surviving end and side panels. Further, the shallowness of the mortise grooves means that the tenons on the end and side panels need to match those grooves with considerable precision, not one seen on the slabs, if the overall shrine is to be an effective construction. Now, given that this was a very high-quality piece of work, one might expect that the tenons and mortise grooves would have been created as individual pairs to maximize the overall appearance of the monument. Instead, we seem to have a monument created with little concern for its overall stability. The present reconstruction emphasizes what a poor fit there is between the grooves and the tenons. It's difficult to see how the side panel could have been mounted in a manner that held it in a secure, unmovable position. Nor can the lid be seen as contributing significantly to stability if, as seems to be the general interpretation, it was intended to be removed from time to time so that one could make use of the contents. Tenons to fit these grooves are equally shallow and inconsistent in their arrangements. The side panel has tenons on the two side edges and the top edge, but not on the bottom edge, whereas the end slabs have tenons on all four edges. For pieces created as part of a unitary exercise, this variation in constructional approach seems very curious. Similarly, unanticipated variations occur when the overall nature of the surviving end and side slabs are considered. The most obvious feature of both is that, though they are of comparable height, they are significantly shorter than the corner slabs they are intended to fit. Additionally, the side slab is markedly trapezoidal in shape. There is, depending on how the monument is reconstructed, a significant gap at the top or the bottom of the end and side slabs. Though the present display in the Cathedral Museum at St Andrews has the gap at the top, the published drawings here have the gap at the bottom. Either way, there's a gap. Now, it's been suggested that the space at the bottom was fitted by transverse bars that do not survive, but this only raises yet another set of problems. Finally, we come to the vexed but crucial question of the lid. The high ridged lid derived from contemporary portable house shrines and pioneered by Radford now seems to find less favour. This seems to be much more the kind of thing that's envisaged. It seems to us that there are three main possibilities at the top if the lid is instead a flat slab, which here we would suggest is the least fanciful solution to the question of how the shrine might have been roofed. But it's impossible to choose between these suggestions or indeed to rule out altogether a more elaborate structure that we can't see here. These comments, which are concerned with constructional rather than artistic aspects, raise a number of issues concerning the current interpretation of the surviving fragments. The current view that the pieces are the surviving fragments of a monumental shrine conceived and created as a single point in time cannot be disproved. Nevertheless, two alternative interpretations deserve consideration in the light of the constructional elements commented upon here. The first is that the pieces do indeed form part of a monumental shrine, comparable to that envisaged in the current interpretation, but that it is a monument reusing some earlier components from other structures. This would explain the lack of correspondence between the height of the corner slabs and the surviving end slabs, and the different treatment of tenons on the end and side slabs. In this view, end and side slabs would appear to be earlier in date than the corner slabs, with an indeterminate interval between them, unless, of course, the corner slabs were also reused but from different structures. Reuse necessarily brings in a bewildering range of chronological scenarios. The second and more radical interpretation, the one that I would certainly favour, starts by rejecting the current view that these are part of a monumental shrine at all. Instead, it suggests that the surviving fragments are just a small part of a much more elaborate scheme involving a decorated altar and elaborate screens exploring celestial and earthly kingship in a major early church at St Andrews, possibly under one of the present churches. Admittedly, we have no evidence for such a church, but it seems universally accepted that the quality of the preservation of the surviving pieces presupposes that they were kept within a high-status funerary chapel before their subsequent burial. In this view, we might suggest that the fragments form part of a larger scheme, perhaps reflected in some form the arrangements of churches in the Eastern Mediterranean, an area that clearly influenced some of the artistic motifs on the pieces themselves. This suggestion that the fragments form part of a larger scheme might also embrace the other two fragments from St Andrews that have tentatively been interpreted as part of the second shrine. In the more elaborate scheme envisaged here, the thickness of the pieces and that they were carved from different stone matter less than when one is considering whether they form part of the same shrine as the main surviving fragments. The difference in stone probably wouldn't matter at all if they were carved. And finally, I want to turn briefly to the Monymusk reliquary. Like so many well-known objects, and most of you will know it, I'm sure, it's sufficiently well-known to feature on the £20 banknote of the Clydesdale Bank. This has never received the detailed analysis and description that's needed to understand it. We are now undertaking this, and the work is being led by Alice Blackwell. Already she's amassed a lot of information. I just want to allude to one of the findings. We have always believed that what we see today is, allowing for the damage through time, that this is the product of a single craftsman or a group of craftsmen. In other words, what we see today is the original piece, just a little bashed around. But Alice's work doesn't support that view. It looks likely that different parts of the reliquary were made at different times. Here are two mounts from the lid that were made in different ways. This is the top. This is the circular one, and I hope you can see there's a gap here between the interlaced panel and the surrounding moulding. And the two things are separate. They're separate pieces. But the square or rectangular mounts are all cast in one piece. They're in fact copying, I think, the appearance of this. That would be our interpretation, but of course you can run it the other way. But certainly it's two different techniques, and it's difficult to explain this in a single workshop. If you can make a rectangular one in one piece, we haven't found an argument as to why you can't make a circular one in one piece. So the consequence is that maybe this raises the possibility that these were reused from some other object, possibly an earlier shrine or something, and that the rectangular mounts were made to match them for this purpose. Now, all of this has serious implications for the date we might give to the individual components that make up the object, and indeed when we might have assumed the shape that we presently see. So now let me turn briefly and then finally to the third strand in our approach, which involves craft commissions to help us understand objects for which our evidence is weak. We have so far undertaken two of these commissions. The first was inspired by images on the sculptured stones, and particularly by those on the well-preserved stone from Fowlis Wester in Perthshire. It, together with another number of other stones, shows people sitting on grand thrones. This is the first evidence for the use of thrones in Scotland. However, no actual thrones survive from early historic Scotland. Thrones are, of course, a feature common to the whole of early historic Europe and the Mediterranean. and they derive ultimately from Roman imperial models. But each area created its own version. What we have here is what I might term the insular throne type. It occurs on stones and in manuscripts created in northern Britain and Ireland. And it's marked by these kind of terminals, animals, or scrolls, and these curved front legs. If you look at manuscripts that are created in London or Winchester at the same time, they have thrones, but they don't look like this. They're a little more cushioning, they're a little more comfy than these. This is sort of austere northern stuff, yeah? In other words, when the carver of the Phallus Wester stone needed to create an image of a throne, he made it look like the throne type he was familiar with. The research project commissioned a master woodcarver called Adrian McCurdy, who lives in the Borders like Walter, to recreate the design of one of these thrones. And this was no easy job, given that we only have a side view. This is hardly, these images weren't after all meant to be technical drawings to enable the creation of a new throne. So Adrian's experience in building furniture and working with timber allowed him to work out the most reasonable design on the evidence available. And this is the result. Now, we learnt a huge amount from this commission, and I don't have time to talk about it all, but about the techniques involved and the possible reasons behind the design and so on. One of the most characteristic features is the single curved arm and leg. And these proved to be a real headache, as we needed a bow that had grown naturally into the right degree of curve in order for the arm to remain structurally sound. I have to say that, completely naive me thought there'd be no problem in getting this. But even Adrian thought there wouldn't be a problem until he started to try and source them. And then he found that you couldn't source curved wood like this commercially anywhere at all. And in the end, we were saved by autumn storms in the Borders, blowing down an oak tree near his workshop that contained two boughs that were neatly curved in exactly the way we wanted. But the consequence of this was that we were using green timber, which, although easier to work, is now developing cracks. Now, these cracks are not threatening the structural stability of the throne, but I think it's unlikely in the early historic world such cracking would have been acceptable in a new throne. So, from all of this, it seems likely that early historic woodworkers were not peripatetic craftsmen, which is one of the images that we have for a lot of craftsmen in early historic Scotland, but needed a sedentary existence, developing and using an intimate knowledge of their local woodlands. Now, the seat is quite high, and as you see, slopes slightly. And this is necessary because for it to be strong enough, it has to be pegged into the structural arm rather than the decorative panels below. So it has to bed into these curved arms. Now, despite what it looks like, it's a lot more comfortable than you think. It really is quite comfortable, although I have to say it's not a seat that allows you to slouch. But then this is a throne, and you're supposed to sit up and be regal, right, on these sort of things. Okay? Now, it also explains the image on the stones, where these guys look like they're sitting very high on these chairs. This wasn't something that, it wasn't that Adrian thought, oh, they're sitting high on the chair, therefore got to put the seat up. But, he put the seat where he thought was the intelligent place to put the seat. And then when you sit on it, of course you mimic this. I thought at the time, I've always thought before this, that these guys were just not capable of showing a guy sitting down in the seat terribly well. I thought it was just poor carving, but obviously not. Now, to work properly, the throne requires a footstool. And these are also shown on the sculptured stones. And we chose to make the footstool out of stone rather than wood, because wood would get scuffed and damaged rather easily. But the footstool stops you sliding off. But because it does that, it's something that needs to be tailored to your height. You know, you can't use the same footstool if you're 5'2" and 6'5". One of you is going to look stupid. Yeah? Now, this led us to realize that while the throne, you know, so tied up in notions of power and authority and regality, might be long-lived and inherited and represent tradition in all of this, okay, that the footstool may have been changed each time. So each person has their own, each new king would have his own individualized footstool, so that he looked his best on the throne. With all these associations with power, we put the throne on display in the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood, although we don't know, because they won't let us see the cameras, whether Alex Salmon took the chance to sit in it. And you see the footstool that we've chosen to create. Now, the second commission that we undertook was in leather, and this stone from Papel in Shetland shows monks carrying book satchels. Because these bags were made from organic materials, we only have very fragmentary remains, and indeed the only remains we have are these pieces from Loch Glashan in Argyll, which Bernard Meehan has interpreted as a book satchel. So, although few survive, book satchels must have been very important. They protected Christian books, which were in themselves very valuable and holy objects. They were not kept on bookshelves. These were not kept on bookshelves, but hung in their satchels from pegs on the wall. Now, I know that the Amiatinus manuscript has Ezra with bookcase behind it, but I'm pretty certain that this is copied from a South Italian bookcase and is not reflected current practice in North Britain. But crucially, satchels also made books portable, so that the monks that travelled Scotland converting people to Christianity could have taken the written word of God with them. So we worked with a young leather worker called Ian Dunlop, based in Edinburgh, to reconstruct a pair of book satchels. One was based on this interpretation, the reinterpretation of the fragments from Argyll, that I showed you a moment ago, while the other, a more fantastical bag, it has to be said, was inspired by a 7th century Latin poem from Ireland, which describes the making of a satchel from gleaming white leather. So these are the finished bags, and some of you may have seen them on display in the museum's entranceway last summer. These commissions are part of a wider research interest in which we're exploring the way objects looked when they were first made. Well, I hope all of this has given you a sense of the way the project has been developing. I'm delighted to say that Glenmorangie remain enlightened and are renewing their support of the project for another 3 years, which I think in the current financial situation is absolutely amazing. And I hope at the end of that period, we'll get a chance to update you on further aspects of the partnership. Thank you very much.